together what we've been kind of working on this week, the relationship between methodology and practice, or methodology and action. And I want to talk about these basically as a way to consider how we go about our work. That's the methodological piece. How do we think about urban situations, and particularly we could say situations in need of transformation, which Reconquista River, we've been talking about that. But before I start, I want to take you on a walk. And the walk isn't in Buenos Aires, but it's in Malmo, which is the city where I live when I work at SLU, but often I'm usually living in New York City. This is a view of Malmo's Western Harbor. And I took this walk quite early in my tenure at SLU, and I decided that I should explore the city. So, and I was interested in the Western Harbor because we were doing a research project there. And I thought I needed a goal, and so I took the turning torso, which is, like Calatrava, is the destination, because you can't just go on a walk without a destination, because you might never get back to the bus to get back to school. And quite immediately, I started to get distracted by a number of things. There was a new library that was had just not quite been finished for the Malmö Hochschule. It had this kind of interesting multilingual facade. And it was constructed at record speed. I thought that was interesting, the information I found about it. I wandered around inside the building, and I found these completely cute little figures bustling around. They weren't exactly students, but I guess students had put them there in the stairs of the school. We see students, business people, and residents bustling about their lives of work in the newly constructed Western Harbor. And I also walked around outside the building. I went out again, and occasionally I kind of lost sight of my destination, which was this tower, which I guess I was going to because hordes of Swedish and foreign planners and architects come to visit the tower every day, and so I was just another one of those mindless architects and planners attracted to Calatrava. So it showed up. I kept walking. I walked around a corner. I passed some trees. I went past a really interesting skateboard park. And then I found this really peculiar urban surface, and I slowed down. I wasn't sure what I was looking at. I didn't know if they were, this is an area that was under transformation, so I couldn't figure out, is this left over from what was there before? Or was this something that was in the process of being made? It was a rather peculiar piece of traffic infrastructure. And then I looked up and I noticed an even more extraordinary thing, which was a kind of stage set landscape, as you can see, set in the middle of an open lot. And I finally got kind of closer to this. I'd gotten close to Calatrava's building. You can see this thing's quite close to the tower, but then I was too intrigued to keep going. I was like, okay, I have to stop here, because I've never seen such an urban landscape in my life. What was this very, very strange place? And it had 4 benches, it had 4 trees in pots, it had 4 very beautifully created astroturf carpets. And it seemed to be some sort of rather unnatural retreat that had been constructed to provide space of contemplation for an image that was posted right at the center. And there's the image. And it was kind of futuristic view. I finally make it there to Calatrava. I don't even have to go to the building because it's in the center of the picture. It's against a beautiful blue expanse, the Öresund. It's an urban set piece kind of pictured here without any reference to what was around it, like looking outward from very high up. And it's a kind of rendering we can find a lot of places. I'm sure you have all seen these renderings of urban developments. And so I want to actually stick with this image for a second, because it's interesting to me in these questions of urban narrative. We've been talking about narrative construction. We've been talking about representation. The view that's presented on that billboard for the redevelopment of the Malmö's Western Harbor really is a reminder of the way that planners and designers are so trained to think ahead, to look beyond what's there now to the then and the future. And in a sense, to prophesize, to envision futures. And it's, in English, the word plot is often used to, it means the same thing as site, a plot of land. All plots have something in common with prophecy, and I think this is true for architects. Architects see a plot, an empty piece of land, and they begin to prophesize. They project what might be there. This is actually a statement about literature and narrative fiction. All narrative plots have something in common with prophecy. Narratives project futures. Now, in my experience, actually, also planners and designers often pay more attention to the end game, the hoped-for outcome of those prophecies, like that billboard, than to the paths that we pick to reach our goals. How do we get to that game, to that picture? And it's actually the paths that I thought it'd be worth talking about today. It's the paths that are the subject of the practice stories I'm talking about, not the projects at the end. And I think it's really important to think about paths because we're living at a time where faster is better. Like we're all meant to kind of speed towards the conclusion, speed toward the end of the project. And it's a world also that's characterized by an overabundance of data, a world where we never really have enough time to process all that information. And we tend to think about this problem of articulated here, that there's more, that the physical and external means of collecting information, the ways that we have to get information in regard to what's happening in the world, have far outrun, they go much faster than the intellectual phase of inquiry and organization of its results. It takes longer to think through why data matters than to collect it. It's much harder, slower work to make sense of information and turn it into knowledge. Now, we often think about this as a kind of problem of living in an internet age, and some of you have seen these slides before. These are some of my favorite slides. Sorry, Antonio and Andre. Erica and Andres, sorry. That's okay. But it's really lovely when you look at when those words were written. It's actually 1927. Almost 90 years ago now, by an American philosopher and educator, John Dewey, when he was worried about not the internet and cloud computing, but telephone and telegraph. But it tells you that really the problem then is not the fact that we live in an era with digitally available information. The problem is basically whenever you are doing research and collecting information, it takes a long time to think it through and make sense of it, whatever the speed of the delivery. The problem is the intellectual phase of inquiry and organization of results. And so after the conversations we've had this week, I wanted to really focus on tools and techniques and methods that we're trained as architects and planners to use, and the way we choose, or the habits, the way we choose to think about complex urban situations. And I have referred to this in other work to habits of mind. What are our habits of mind? How do we think? And the two practice stories really are about habits of mind, how we intellectually organize urban research. And they are also the vehicle for these stories, or they're stories about professional encounters with formerly industrialized urban areas, and also two dirty waterways. So the first one is a story, I would say, of a relative success. And it comes out of my consulting practice, designCONTENT. And the setting for the story was a publicly funded project for the most polluted waterway in New York City, Newtown Creek. And there was a client, there were three separate nonprofits, NGOs. One, a very local NGO, Greenpoint Manufacturing Design, was neighborhood. Riverkeeper, which was a kind of regional NGO focused on the Hudson River, and the Newtown Creek Alliance, which was more of a kind of not highly localized, but also neighborhood NGO focused on the creek as a whole. And the second project, and I'll come back to the other one in a minute, was actually for area along the Emscher River, Velheimermark, which is a town along the Emscher River, and it was involves a graduate planning studio that I taught at Columbia. I've talked a bit about this week, to explore development strategies for the Emscher River in the Ruhr in Germany. I don't have to say a lot of details because we've already been that. And the focus was kind of to explore the transferability of knowledge gleaned from the Emscher to possible urban landscape transformation strategies in New York, but also it relates then to, I think, what we've been talking about, the Reconquista River. So both of the projects dealt with very similar locations. They were highly polluted waterways. They had multiple stakeholders. They were variously scaled at many potential impacts. Newtown Creek, the goal was to increase industrial activity, actually, and along the Emscher, the idea was to explore what happens after industry leaves. So they had slightly different goals. And I'm going to start with the Newtown Creek project, and I'll give you a little bit of background. So these nonprofit partners actually hired me 2 years into a project, and they hired me when the project had gone, all of a sudden, we say, it went pear-shaped, the English would say. You could also say it went south, which is a bad thing to say. No, it all went off track. And this project was really in a terrible mess, and they hired me they thought I could fix it. They had $600,000 in state funds to actually produce a plan for the area that was, at the time, the largest public grant given for this Brownfield Opportunity Area program. And they had a large consultant group on board already. Things weren't going very well, and I knew about Newtown Creek because I had taught a studio on it some years earlier. It was the first experience with this Brownfield Opportunity Area program, and I had absolutely no idea what I was getting into. Let's just say that. So the BOA program, which Brownfield Opportunity Area Grants, was a U.S., it was a State Department, a state-level funded program and for cleaning up brownfields. And brownfield in the U.S. doesn't just mean industrial site, it means polluted site. Like in Europe, a brownfield will mean industrial, but brownfield in the United States means toxic. And the BOA plan was basically something where municipalities or community organizations or nonprofits could get money to help plan ways to clean up and invite new development in these sites. And so it was trying to build capacity for these areas to invite investors who not only would build, but they had to clean up the sites. They're very unattractive to developers. So the state realized they had to do something to make these places more attractive. And this was one of the ways they did it. And most BOA plans involved a change of use from industrial to non-industrial. That was the thing. But the Newtown Creek was different, and the reason it got all this money was because it was arguing that it wanted to didn't want to not become industrial, but it wanted to change the industry that was there. And it was looking for also, the BOA was a program that also was trying to create opportunities for collaboration between different government agencies, which was interesting. And it was trying to change what I would call the institutionalized geography of urban planning and regional planning, which is often in very separate silos that really hinders the way projects can happen. And so it was a mechanism to potentially change habit of mind. So that was the BOA plan. What's Newtown Creek? Quickly, it's a low-lying wetland area. It is right actually here. This is Manhattan. And it was identified in the planning, by the planning department as a significant maritime industrial area. That's actually a zone. So it's an important area for maritime industry. It's an urban waterway. Was zoned for heavy manufacturing. It has a very long history of industrial use. Today's businesses require a lot of space. They're like the things we saw the other day. They don't have a lot of workers. Wastewater treatment, concrete manufacturing, recycling, vehicle storage, kind of like the Reconquista. And there's a lot of working storage activity that goes on. A lot of properties that go right to the water's edge, so you can't really access it. And it also forms the border between Brooklyn and Queens, which are two boroughs, much like we saw yesterday with Hurlingham and Moron. So that's just a bit about this waterway. It's a federal Superfund site, which, do you know that term here? Superfund is a federal program for cleaning up extremely dirty, extremely toxic areas. And it is also the location of the largest recorded oil spill in the history of the United States, even bigger than the Exxon Valdez, because for 60 years there were oil drums here just dripping oil into the ground, and nobody knew about it. So in Superfund sites, what happens is the federal government gives money to start cleanup, but then it gets that money back by suing property owners to pay for what it cleaned up. So it all sounds very nice in principle, but actually in practice, they're very hard to take a Superfund site into the cleanup phase. You can identify something as a Superfund site, but often it never really gets cleaned up because the money doesn't go there. So you can see here, these are pages from the report that was produced, but there's 70 brownfields in this area. So that's why it was a brownfield opportunity area project. It wasn't for areas with one brownfield, it was for areas with many, many brownfields. And it was trying to get a development strategy for that. Now, this page from the final report gives you an idea of how many separate government agencies were actually involved in the planning exercise. And so trying to get all of these people to the same table, as I said before, is a big piece of the project. The client's goal was to get everyone behind the vision of an economically and an environmentally viable industrial community at the heart of the urban region. So they had to undo the narrative of the dirtiest waterway. They had to undo the narrative of industry is dirty, which, because the predominant narrative now in New York is industry's dirty, waterways are recreational, you have to put housing there. And they wanted to keep industry there. And they wanted to keep a viable industrial community at the heart of the urban region. So these are pages actually from the application guidance when you went for money for a BOA, which with instructions of how to apply for money. And the state basically asked for an inventory of all of the information, brownfields, land use, zoning, transportation systems. You can see here there's actually, number 2, inventory and analysis, and at the bottom I also said summary analysis. I highlighted those. I'm doing that because I wanted to show you a little bit how essentially confused the structure that you are given is. You're asked to provide information in a very broken down way that reflects the silos of typical planning, even though the ambition of the project is to break down those silos. So I'm showing you this because you can see really how hard it is to break out of existing habits of mind and ways of working, even though the people who are behind this project want to not have you think in these different ways, they still ask you to think in these different ways when you produce your work. So it's like, am I making sense? So when I came on board, the clients were halfway through the project. They had done a data dump. They had collected tons and tons and tons of data, but they didn't know what to do with it. And in part, it wasn't their fault because they had this set of instructions that kind of looked like they were asking for just a lot of different data without synthesis. And so the framework, I think the point I'm trying to make here is that the state framework continued to privilege data over thoughtful organization. And the result was planning documents that were framing very complex situations in a very overly simplified way. And my job was to shift how the team basically saw the problem so the consultants that were doing the day-to-day work could bring back and kind of bring to the forefront the connections, the relationships, the things that crossed between the different silos. Like, we don't see first and then define, we define and then we see. I talked about this earlier this week. And my job really in shifting that, was, I felt like I could do it because of some work I'd done earlier with planning students and design students at Columbia, looking at this very same site in a studio at the center here. This is Newtown Creek, and this was a student mapping of all the different scales up at which Newtown Creek functions in urban processes. So it visualizes the kind of dynamic, multi-scalar set of relations that were caught in this place. And so I was hoping to get the group that I was working with also to start thinking in this way. And that way of thinking really of constellating across different silos of drawing relations, for me, draws on work of people like Doreen Massey, kind of theoretical framework, who talks about the uniqueness of place coming out of interactions and articulations of social relations. And she talks about the fact that many of those relations are taking place at a far greater scale than what we actually define as the place itself. So this notion of area of control, area of influence, area of effect, all being interrelated. And so, I can talk more about the outcome of this process. I'm not really here to tell you about the project or what came out, but I'm really here to sort of point out that in order to get integrated outcomes in these complex projects, you have to start with an integrative approach, and the state really did not do that. But my clients actually realized that the report needed to be more than an inventory, and that was why I'm saying it was a relative success, because in the end, they did adopt a more relational way of looking. The project won an award, and there was an understanding in the end of a more constellated, dynamic set of on-site relations. The second story I want to tell you basically is less successful, and it's about this graduate studio I taught at Columbia. And a constellation becomes a constellation only through being chosen from among other configurations. So why do I have that up there? In order to make these collaborations into productive constellations of exchange, you actually have to choose what figure you're going after. You have to point at something. And so this second, not such a positive story for the Emscher studio, the client, the Emscher Genossenschaft, is this 17...
no, that's the water body.
Oh, that's the water body.
That was the regional association
Of water body, and that's my students all at a presentation there. this project was a constellation of perspectives, my own perspective and those of my students in the planning studio. And here they're meeting their client. So I'm going to explain just very quickly a little bit about the Columbia planning studios. They're done as practicums, so you have clients, and where graduate students work as planners for real clients in real places with real problems. And it was a little strange for me because it was the first planning studio I had taught. I've always taught design studios. I will tell you later if you're interested why I ended up doing that. But my pedagogical perspective coming into this studio was very, very different than my students' expectations. And the reason that I was asked to teach the studio was the head of the planning department at that time had actually graduated from a design school and then studied planning. And he thought his planning students would benefit from being exposed to a different perspective. And I was kind of interested in rehearsing this engagement with a neighboring field. So keep this difference in mind that I'm talking about. This is just the framework for the studio. And so I don't really think I need to say so much about the Hampshire River. I mean, the studio is taking place on one piece of the Hampshire River, and there's a photograph of something similar to what we saw yesterday. And it's an open sewer. It's undergoing a remediation project. We heard all that yesterday. I guess what I could say is that the problem for the studio is to develop a visionary kind of planning concept for this one location that could be taken as a demonstration project, perhaps for other locations. This is actually a photograph of a map that Lisa unrolled for my students when we were sitting at Zollverein, where we met her, because she met me in my studio there. And the kind of things that I was really interested in were these planning across scales, planning from a transdisciplinary perspective, and planning for unpredicted changes through time, which are very much issues that we've been talking about here today. And so I was excited about teaching this studio because I thought it had opportunities to address these issues. We visited the kindergarten and got stories from local community members. The students were really interested in gathering those. We went biking on the bike. We visited the kind of Zollverein Museum. We did it all. And my students did a number of really kind of valuable kind of research projects on different aspects of the Hampshire. And it's really intriguing to me, this location, because it's where urban transformation processes are actually driven by immense landscape infrastructure projects and landscape alterations. You were talking about that yesterday, Lisa. And it provokes really critical questions about institutionalized planning practices and the separation, for example, between engineering, landscape, architecture, and planning concerns. All those things come together in this project, and it's something to perhaps think about here. In the Hampshire Valley, received notions, you really talked about this yesterday, Lisa, between nature versus man-made, landscape versus city, formed versus found. They don't fit. It throws up in the air concepts or dualities that often drive much of what we do. And physical geography, this is a map of those slag heaps, a topographic mapping of the slag heaps. It strongly argues for a transdisciplinary planning approach, precisely because the normal boundaries don't apply. It also calls for planning in time because the area's future could not be predicted. And the project required a kind of set of adaptive concepts that could accommodate developments that nobody really could predict at the outset of the project. All of these things were extremely interesting to me because of, in a sense, the uncertainty. So I focused on kind of issues of scale, transscalar issues, of temporal issues, of uncertainty, because I wanted my students to actually engage in cross-category thinking. I didn't want them to fall into neat categories. But much as I tried to encourage them, my students were really uninterested in this. And our perspectives on process and the value of transdisciplinarity never aligned. They arrived with a super clear picture of how planning works, and they knew exactly where they fit in that picture. One of the students was interested in transportation. One of the students was interested in the ecology. One of the students was interested in mobility. One of the students was interested in housing. And, it made me really grumpy. I didn't understand it. But it's actually not surprising, I realize now, because that's how we organize planning education into courses that are neatly carved up, like neighborhood planning, infrastructure planning, regional planning. This is how we organize planning reports. This is why I wanted that slide, right? So this turns into that. But that's how the world works. So, it's a bit of a problem. And my students just from the very beginning delegated responsibilities into each of them took the area that they loved. They did the research on that piece. They had a very orderly system for working through the problem based on their individual interest. They organized their research according to conventional diagram of kind of research areas, and they thought this would let them avoid conflicts, which it did not. There were many, many conflicts in that studio. It also meant that they couldn't actually constellate their individual intelligences into something that exceeded the sum of the parts. They failed to collaborate. And it was really for this reason that I got super sad. And I remain kind of sad about that studio, and maybe this is why I get really excited to be involved in these kinds of projects, because in that place I was really unable to help this group of people bridge their divides, and I couldn't figure out a way to negotiate the gap between what I realized later was a kind of design and non-design oriented habit of mind. So why would I choose to publicly share this failure? Like most people, that was a really bad experience. And now you're talking about it to people. I'm choosing it because my inability to do that really has nothing to do with me. I kind of figured out. I mean, probably it might have something to do with me, but I think this is a really important observation by Mark Jarzenbeck. He cannot recall, he's an urban designer, a single meeting in the institution where I teach in which the architects have met with the urban planners down the hall to discuss their common interests and concerns. This is a common breach in academia. So my inability to bridge design and non-design oriented habits of mind exposes essentially the academic roots of a professional culture that is very deeply invested in maintaining clear-cut areas of expertise. Because they also reflect clear-cut areas of control and power. Even though those clear-cut areas of expertise are targeting at essentially unclear urban situations. They're trying to make complexity simple. But in fact, cities are, when we use these kinds of methods like the BOA inventory or the siloed research framework of my students, we get into real trouble. And urban situations are more like this amazing artifact that I found in the Gleisdreiecke Park in Berlin, which is a kind of Bruno Latour talks about monsters, hybrids as monsters, and this is kind of a monstrosity, but it's bizarre. It almost is like it's how can you imagine it? But it's a much more realistic landscape, urbanscape, than that strange little park where I started. This is an industrial urban scape. This is it. It's not the hallucinatory oasis in Malmo with those 4 potted trees. Nature and culture, architecture and landscape do not sit in their separate little quadrants. And so, how do we make sense of the prime matter of an urban complexity of urban situations when those situations do not make sense? And so the stories are kind of an odd collection, maybe, together about our choice of experiences or activities to make understandings of urban situations. But really, why, my point is quite simple. The urban site might be concrete. The urban situation might be a material place, the urban site. But the complexity of urban situation is a methodological field. The thing that we call a city isn't really a thing at all. It's more a space kind of operation almost. It's open to multiple modes of engagement. It demands a whole host of methodological approaches, not just one. And that's, I think, what we've been talking about in certain ways this week. That we've been talking at a meta level of questions, and methodology is a critical research topic in itself. That's kind of one thing that I think can come out of this Reconquista project, and I think we ended up there today. And I also think that this idea of when you can get to the point where this city or the urban condition is not a thing, it is actually open to multiple modes of engagement, to multiple modes of research encounter. And that's kind of why I think transdisciplinary collaboration opens up for discussion and debate how we might make those encounters and what we might make of those encounters and what we can make from those encounters, which I guess is the place where I might leave it. I mean, it's sort of coming back to where we started today, but a transdisciplinary collaboration really opens up a whole other way of debating what urban futures might be. And, collectively, creatively collaborating to reanimate this Reconquista ground and to find those tools. It's super exciting. So I leave it with, there's no such thing as the character of the city. There's no such thing as the way the city is. Thanks. I don't know how long I took, but not too long.